Welcome and thank you all for standing by. At this time, I would like to inform all participants that your lines have been placed in a listen-only mode throughout the duration of today's presentation. Today's call is also being recorded. If anyone has any objections, you may disconnect at this time. And I would now like to turn the call over to Mr. Michael Hawes from U.S. Census. Sir, you may begin.
Thank you, operator. Good afternoon, everyone, or to those of you from Points West, good morning. I'm Michael Hawes, Senior Advisor for Data Access and Privacy at the U.S. Census Bureau. And welcome to the first webinar in our series on understanding the 2020 Census Disclosure Avoidance System. Today's session will provide a high-level overview of the Census Bureau's decision to modernize the privacy safeguards we will be using to protect the confidentiality of your personal information in the 2020 Census data products. These new protections are based on a framework for assessing privacy risk known as differential privacy. For those of you who have attended prior presentations of mine, the material in today's webinar will look very familiar. Today's session is intended to be a 101 level introduction to the topic. In subsequent webinars in this series, my Census Bureau colleagues and I will be providing more detailed and technical walkthroughs of the topics I'll be introducing today. All webinars in this series will begin at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Time, and we will be archiving recordings of these webinars on our website. Throughout today's webinar, I encourage you to submit any questions that you may have via the Q&A feature in the WebEx platform. And please be sure to send those to all panelists because my colleagues Jennifer Shopcorn and Michelle Hedrick will be answering some of your questions in real time during the presentation. And we'll have time at the end of the presentation for additional questions. Before I begin, I want to thank all of my colleagues at the Census Bureau who have contributed to the information in today's presentation, and to state that any opinions and viewpoints expressed today are entirely my own and do not represent the opinions or viewpoints of the U.S. Census Bureau. So the Census Bureau's commitment to privacy and confidentiality is absolutely critical to our ability to produce the high-quality statistics about the nation's people and economy that the public expect from us. Protecting the privacy of our respondents and the confidentiality of their data is a legal requirement for us under Title 13, Sections 8B and 9. But more importantly, protecting privacy and confidentiality is a core and critical element of our institutional culture. And when we publish our data products, we can't just consider the privacy risks that exist today, because once we've published those data, they're out there forever. So our legal and ethical obligations to protect respondent confidentiality require us to make sure that those data products are also properly protected against the privacy threats that may arise tomorrow. Over the past century, the Census Bureau has been a world leader in the design and implementation of the various methods that can be used to safeguard privacy in public data releases. And as new privacy threats have been identified over the years, the Census Bureau has worked diligently to improve the safeguards that we use to mitigate those privacy threats. Our adoption of differential privacy for the 2020 census is merely the latest step in a long history of innovation and continuous improvements to our privacy protections. And it's a necessary one to counter new 21st century privacy threats that are being posed by the increasing proliferation of third-party data sources and increasingly powerful computing algorithms that make re-identification of individual respondents in our published official statistics easier and easier with each passing year. The challenge we face is that we collect information from the public in order to fulfill our mission to produce quality statistics about the nation. As I'm sure all of you know, information tabulated from the decennial census is used for a wide array of purposes. Census data are used to apportion seats in the House of Representatives, to draw district boundaries for federal, state, and local elections, to distribute over $675 billion each year. But census data are also routinely used for critical decision-making at all levels of government, and they enable policymakers, businesses, analysts, and researchers across the country to measure and assess trends about who we are and where we're going as a society. Supporting these myriad data uses requires publishing an enormous amount of statistics and data tables, often at very fine levels of granularity and geographic detail. Unfortunately, we know that every time you publish any statistic that's calculated from a confidential data source, you're going to reveal or leak a tiny bit of private or confidential information in the process. In 2003, in what became later known as the database reconstruction theorem, it was demonstrated that if you release too many statistics at too high a degree of accuracy, well, then you're going to eventually reveal the entire underlying confidential data source. And this challenge is even greater when you consider the privacy threats that we face today. They say that nothing on the internet ever goes away, and the same could be said for data once it's gone out in the wild. Over the past 20 to 30 years, we've seen a massive proliferation of third-party data that could be used to re-identify individuals in our official statistical data products. Data about us are collected all the time by the companies we interact with, by data brokers, and through social media. These data could be used in an attempt to pick out specific individuals in the data that we publish. Meanwhile, technology has also improved substantially. Computers can now easily perform the complex matching algorithms that are necessary to leverage that third-party data in an attempt to re-identify individuals in the data that we publish. And these parallel trends are not abstract concerns. They represent real concrete threats to protecting confidentiality that need to be addressed. There's a common misperception that aggregating data will be sufficient to protect privacy. And while that may have once been the case and may still be true for some very limited data releases, it is not sufficient to protect privacy in large-scale statistical data products. In fact, aggregate tabular data can often be thought of like a giant game of Sudoku. With Sudoku, if you have enough numbers pre-populated into the grid, then there's one and only one solution to the puzzle. Well, the same is true for statistical data tables. If you publish enough data tables broken down by enough demographic or economic characteristics, well, then eventually there's going to be one and only one set of individual level records that could have yielded the published tabular data. So let's look at an example. Imagine you collected some basic demographics about the 7 people who live on a particular block. You then published some aggregate descriptive statistics about those individuals. How many were female? How many were black? What's the median age of married individuals? And so on. Well, with those basic aggregate statistics, it becomes a trivial matter to solve for the only set of individual level records that could have yielded those tabular results. I say trivial, and I really mean it. It took a 2013 MacBook Pro a grand total of 0.2 seconds to reconstruct these individual level records from those aggregate data. Our would-be attacker now has individual level records for everyone on the block, but can she actually re-identify any of them? Well, it turns out this is also often a relatively trivial exercise to perform. While the reconstructed individual level records didn't have names on them, they did have a number of what we call pseudo-identifiers that could be used to link to an outside data source that does have names. In this particular example, the attacker could use age and sex to match the reconstructed records to third-party data, say, for example, voter registration lists for that block. Now it's easy to attach a name to the records, and our attacker has just learned Jane, Joe, and John's race and relationship status. So with the risks of reconstruction and re-identification attacks in mind, and the knowledge that these types of attacks are getting easier and easier to perform as computers improve and as third-party data increases, the Census Bureau decided to conduct some simulations to see how vulnerable the decennial census can be to this type of attack. So remember when I said before that the database reconstruction theorem tells us that every release of a calculation or tabulation that's derived from a confidential data source will leak a tiny bit of private information or confidential information in the process. Well, to give you a sense of scale, the 2010 census collected just a handful of attributes for the approximately 309 million people in the United States. That gave us about 1.9 billion confidential data points to protect. But the 2010 census data products that we published following the census released over 150 billion aggregate statistics that were derived from those 1.9 billion confidential data points. So with the knowledge that each statistic that you release leaks a tiny bit of information, we wanted to see if those 150 billion statistics were leaking enough to allow an attacker to re-identify individuals in our published data. The answer, unfortunately, was an emphatic yes. In fact, using only a small portion of the published 2010 census data products, Census Bureau researchers were able to accurately reconstruct individual level data for all 6 million inhabited blocks in the U.S. Moreover, we were able to reconstruct detailed individual level information, including sex, age to within a year, race, and ethnicity for 71% of the entire U.S. population. Then linking these reconstructed records to commercially available data from the time period, we were able to confirm that we had accurately re-identified on all variables for 52 million individuals. And if you want to learn more about these simulated reconstruction and re-identification attacks, I suggest tuning in for our May 7th webinar on this topic. We'll be going into these simulations in much more detail with a lot more information. So it should go without saying that the results of these reconstruction and re-identification simulations were a real eye-opener for us. And so recognizing the growing threat of these privacy attacks, these re-identification attacks, the Census Bureau recognized that our traditional approaches to protecting privacy in our public data products were becoming increasingly insufficient. So to meet our continuing obligations to safeguard respondent information, the Census Bureau committed to modernizing our approach to privacy protection for the 2020 census. So how do you protect privacy in a public data release? Well, this whole approach is known as disclosure avoidance or statistical disclosure limitation. And disclosure avoidance methods generally seek to make reconstruction and re-identification attacks more difficult by one or more of three approaches. They either seek to reduce the precision of the data that you publish, they seek to remove vulnerable records from the data that you're publishing, or they work by adding uncertainty to the data that you do publish. And you can use one or more of these approaches at any given time, and they serve to make it more difficult or challenging for an external attacker to pick out specific individuals in your published data and learn something about them. Now, commonly used disclosure avoidance techniques, or traditional disclosure avoidance techniques, include such things as complementary suppression of individual cells or records in your data, rounding your published statistics to introduce a little bit of coarsening of the data. You can top or bottom code extreme values so they don't stand out as much. You can sample from a larger population. You can swap records like we did for the 2010 census. And swapping is itself just another form of noise injection, and noise injection occurs when you are introducing a little bit of uncertainty into the data, again, to make re-identification and reconstruction more difficult. The problem with disclosure avoidance techniques is that they have an inevitable impact on the data. Any statistical technique that you use to protect privacy, whether it's suppression, swapping, noise infusion, and so on, all of those techniques will impose a fundamental trade-off between the degree of privacy protection on the one hand and the resulting accuracy or usefulness of the data on the other. And swap rates, noise infusion parameters, cell suppression thresholds, and so on are the parameters that determine this trade-off, that determine whether you are on the privacy end of the spectrum or the accuracy side of the spectrum or somewhere in between. The other problem with disclosure avoidance techniques, as they've traditionally been applied, is that it can be difficult to really quantify the degree of privacy protection that they afford. They're kind of scattershot solutions. So when faced with rising disclosure risks, practitioners of disclosure avoidance methods have to adjust their implementation parameters to keep pace with those growing risks. But because of the scattershot nature of traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance, that often led to overprotecting some data, making it less usable than necessary, while underprotecting your more vulnerable records, essentially not applying enough uncertainty to those. And so being able to quantify this has been a real problem for traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance. And that brings us to differential privacy. It's important to recognize that differential privacy is not a disclosure avoidance method the same way that swapping or cell suppression or traditional noise infusion techniques are. Rather, differential privacy is really a framework for defining and then quantifying the privacy protection that is afforded by any disclosure avoidance technique that you use. Any individual that's reflected in a particular statistic that you publish will have contributed towards that statistic's value. They're represented in any cell of your data tables, for example. And every statistic that you publish, as I mentioned before, will leak or reveal a small amount of private information about the individuals included in that statistic. Differential privacy as a privacy accounting framework allows you to assess each particular individual's contribution to any statistic that you want to publish, and to measure and then subsequently limit how much confidential information about that individual will leak when you publish your results. So when you combine this privacy accounting framework of differential privacy with noise injection methods of disclosure avoidance, differential privacy allows you to precisely control the amount of confidential information leakage that will occur in your published statistics. And this accounting framework, combined with noise infusion, provides a number of significant benefits over traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance. For starters, unlike the kind of scattershot approach that traditional disclosure avoidance methods often had, differentially private noise infusion is infinitely tunable. Your implementation will have a number of parameters, or you can think of them as dials, that can be set anywhere on the spectrum from perfect privacy at the one extreme to perfect accuracy at the other. And the privacy guarantee that you are able to give your respondents by using a differentially private noise infusion approach, this guarantee is mathematically provable, so you can quantify exactly how strong your privacy protections are. And more importantly, it's future-proof, so you don't have to predict what new privacy threats or risks are going to arise tomorrow, next week, next year, or even next decade. And third, the precise calibration of those parameters or dials, the calibration of the noise that you're infusing into the data, provides you an optimal level of data accuracy for any given level of privacy protection. And these are really important advantages that differentially private approaches to disclosure avoidance have over their traditional counterparts. And if you want to learn more about how the parameters and dials of our implementation of differentially private noise infusion works, I suggest you tune in to our May 13th webinar, where we're going to be going into the details of our implementation of this technique through our top-down algorithm. So What constitutes an acceptable level of privacy risk? This is the big challenge. We know that the only way that you could absolutely eliminate all risk of re-identification in data products would be to never publish any usable data at all. And clearly, as the nation's leading provider of quality statistics, that isn't a viable option for us. So instead, we have to find the optimal balance where we're providing data that are sufficiently accurate for their intended uses, while also being sufficiently noisy or uncertain to meet our legal and ethical obligations to safeguard the data against re-identification attacks. And finding this balance can be a challenge, but it's ultimately a policy decision that needs to be made. That said, once you identify where that optimal balance in between those extremes of privacy and accuracy are, that point on the spectrum can become known as your privacy loss budget. And you'll often see the privacy loss budget abbreviated as PLB or represented by the Greek letter epsilon. Much like a monetary budget, the lower your privacy loss budget, the less privacy you're willing to give up in return for accuracy. A privacy loss budget of 0 would be the world of perfect privacy but completely useless data. And an epsilon of infinity would be the world of perfect data with no privacy protections at all. Now, there are a lot of naysayers, we'll call them, who say that differentially private approaches destroy the usability or fitness for use of data compared to traditional disclosure avoidance techniques. I want to be clear that when comparing differentially private approaches to traditional disclosure avoidance methods, neither approach is inherently any better than the other from the perspective of data accuracy. It all depends on how they're implemented and what parameters are used for those implementations. I've seen some differentially private approaches that result in highly accurate data when they're well designed and have sufficiently high privacy loss budgets. And I've seen many implementations of traditional disclosure avoidance techniques that have resulted in terrible data quality when they were poorly designed or when they have particularly high swap rates or cell suppression thresholds. Where differentially private approaches and traditional disclosure avoidance methods do substantially differ is on the privacy front. Because differentially private approaches using that privacy accounting framework that I mentioned before provide quantifiable and future-proof guarantees that traditional methods typically cannot. So what does all this mean for the 2020 census? Well, for starters, I want to be absolutely clear that our adoption and our modernization of disclosure avoidance for the 2020 census does not alter our constitutional mandate to apportion seats for the U.S. House of Representatives using the actual enumeration of the state populations. The apportionment data that the Census Bureau released last week did not include any noise. They were the actual enumerated counts for each state, and state population totals in our subsequent data products will not have any noise added to them either. Our remaining data products, including the Public Law 94-171 redistricting data and our subsequent data products, will have privacy protections applied as they have in prior censuses. Only this time, the noise will come from our differentially private approaches rather than from the record swapping noise infusion mechanism that we used for the 2010 census and before. Our modernization of our disclosure avoidance methods does require us to reevaluate our both the quantity and the form of some of the statistics that we're releasing, so the 2020 data products will look somewhat different than they have in prior decades. And if you want to see the proposed changes to the 2020 census data products, you can just go to the census.gov website and search 2020 census data products, and you can see what the proposed table specs for the data products will be. So I mentioned before that the privacy loss budget, or epsilon, determines where on the spectrum from perfect privacy to perfect accuracy the resulting data will be. And as I said, this is ultimately a policy decision, And for the 2020 census, these decisions will be made by the Census Bureau's Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee, or DSEP. DSEP will be making the first of those decisions in June of this year for the redistricting data product, and subsequent decisions on this in the months following that. But they need to decide the allocation of that privacy loss budget across the different data products. You can think of this as a fixed pie for any given level of privacy protection. And each data product will receive a share of that pie. So the redistricting data will get one portion of the privacy loss budget. Our demographic and housing characteristics files will get an additional portion of the budget. The detailed demographic and housing characteristics and detailed tribal data will get a subsequent allocation of that privacy loss budget, and so on. But in addition to allocating the privacy loss budget across those data products, DSEP will also need to make decisions about the allocation of privacy loss budget within those data products to the various tabulations at different levels of geography that form that data product in question. So how much accuracy and privacy loss budget do you assign to county level tabulations over tract level tabulations, for example? Or how much do you allocate for race and Hispanic origin tabulations versus age and total population tabulations, that sort of thing. And the more you allocate to one set of tabulations over another, or to one geographic level over another, determines the relative accuracy of the data products at that level. So what have we been doing recently? One of the major activities that we've been doing from December of 2020 through March of this year was some substantial tuning of our top-down algorithm for the redistricting use case and Voting Rights Act use case as reflected in the PL94-171 redistricting data file. So to do that tuning, we conducted over 600 full-scale runs of our top-down algorithm using the complete PL94-171 data product schema. And the goal of conducting these 600 experimental runs was to evaluate the resulting accuracy that we get when we vary various parameters of the algorithm, those dials that I mentioned before. And the things that we were evaluating were what was the impact of different levels of the privacy loss budget? What was the impact of varying the set of queries that we use in compiling the PL data from the census edited file? What's the impact of different allocations of our privacy loss budget across the geographic levels within the algorithm? And then what's the impact of different allocations of the privacy loss budget across the queries that we're using? And throughout each of these, we worked with subject matter experts in both our demographic and decennial directorates to evaluate the accuracy of the resulting data from these experimental runs to inform the setting of those parameters. And if you want to learn more about how we've been evaluating accuracy and fitness for use throughout these experiments and as we go into our final decision-making, I encourage you to log in for our May 14th and May 21st webinars, where we'll be doing deeper dives into those accuracy measures and fitness for use evaluations. So since October 2019, the Census Bureau has been periodically releasing demonstration data products that have used 2010 census data for our data users to evaluate. And the analyses that our data users have provided based on those demonstration data products have been enormously valuable to us as we've worked to improve the implementation of our top-down algorithm and as we've been working to tune the algorithm to maximize fitness for use for the priority uses of census data. Now, the first 4 of these sets of demonstration data, the releases in October of 2019 and May, September, and November of 2020, used a conservative global privacy loss budget that was set by DSEP for the original October 2019 release. Now, if you remember from before, low levels of epsilon, low privacy loss budgets, move you much closer to the privacy end of the spectrum at the expense of accuracy. And high privacy loss budgets move you to the accuracy side of the spectrum with less privacy protection. So the 4 demonstration products that we released from 2019 through 2020 were on that privacy side of the spectrum. But I want to stress that the 2020 census data products will not be held to that fixed privacy loss budget. On April 28th of this year, we released a new set of privacy-protected microdata files, PPMFs, and detailed summary metrics using a different global privacy loss budget, an epsilon of 12.2 versus the 4.5 that we used for the prior releases. And this higher privacy loss budget more closely approximates the level of privacy loss budget that we anticipate DCEP will be considering for the actual 2020 census redistricting data file. So this new demonstration product reflects the tuning of the algorithm, the tuning of those parameters that I referenced a few minutes ago. Now, to allow our data users to also compare algorithmic changes without the extra privacy loss budget, we also released PPMS and detailed summary metrics using the exact same settings, but with the same privacy loss budget that we had used for the prior demonstration data releases. So if you check out our demonstration data page, you'll see files both at the new 12.2 privacy loss budget, but also at the 4.5 that we used previously. And then in September, as we are publishing the actual 2020 census redistricting data, we plan to release a final set of 2010 demonstration data using the actual production code and production settings that we used for the production run of the 2020 redistricting data file. And that will allow data users to evaluate the anticipated fitness for use of the actual 2020 data. Now, the changes to our algorithm design and settings and parameters reflected in the April 2021 demonstration product really incorporate substantial and cumulative feedback that we've received from our data user community throughout the DAS development process. And we encourage and look forward to receiving feedback from our data users on these new demonstration data products, because that feedback, your own analyses of these data, will help to inform DCEP's decision-making next month regarding the final privacy loss budget and allocation for the 2020 census redistricting data. So please check out these new demonstration data products and provide feedback to us. The deadline to submit feedback is May 28th. So it's not a huge window, but it is really a critical period to get additional feedback from you all on your own assessments of fitness for use of these data. You can send comments to our dedicated email box for the DAS, which is 2020das@census.gov, and please use the subject line April 2021 demonstration data. We welcome all feedback on these demonstration products, but particularly useful and actionable feedback would describe your own assessments, your own analyses of fitness for use of the demonstration data for your particular use cases. Would these data be satisfactory for your needs? Let us know how you came to that conclusion. If you found them lacking on the fitness for use spectrum, how incrementally would we have to improve the accuracy of the data to make them meet your needs? And have you identified any improbable results in the data that would be helpful for us to understand? On the other side, we want to hear from privacy experts as well. Do the proposed data products present any confidentiality concerns that we should address? Have we gone too far to the accuracy side and not including enough privacy protection? And lastly, for a lot of these decisions, a lot of these parameters involve trade-offs. So if there are improvements that you've identified in these new demonstration data that you want to make sure we retain for the final production runs, please let us know. Tell us where we've done a good job so that we know not to touch those when we're making future parameter setting decisions. If you want to stay informed of our ongoing work on the 2020 Census Disclosure Avoidance System, please subscribe to our 2020 Census Data Products newsletters. You can just search disclosure avoidance at the census.gov webpage and it'll take you there. That's always where we provide the latest information on all of our ongoing work and developments relating to the DAS. You can also visit our website. We post a lot of useful information there, frequently asked questions, blogs, our newsletter topics, additional resources, and much, much more. And that's also where you'll find the login information for our upcoming webinars in this series. And now with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'd be happy to take some questions. So again, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature, and be able to see those momentarily. All right. Screen is not cooperating here. Okay, so we got a question here, and I apologize that these are not in order, but I'm just grabbing them as I see them. Could I talk a little bit about how post-processing factors impact data accuracy? So that's a great question, and it's one that we're actually going to be going into in more detail in our upcoming webinar on the top-down algorithm. But essentially, the form and format of your resulting data products can impact accuracy on occasion if you impose requirements on things like non-negativity or tabular consistency and so on. Those are functions of the actual infusion of noise into the data. If you have to infuse noise into each individual statistic, and if you also require that your statistics all be internally consistent, meaning that subcategories add to their parent category and child geographies add up to their parent geographies and so on, then you need to perform additional post-processing of your now privatized numbers to enforce that consistency. And that enforcement of those output requirements, like tabular consistency, can introduce error of themselves that's independent of the noise that's necessary to protect privacy. And so that's where the post-processing can influence accuracy as well. And we'll be going into that in more detail later on. Okay, let's pull another one here. Okay, question here. Can you talk a bit more about how you arrived at the 12.2 privacy loss budget that's reflected in the new demonstration data? Was it a golden mean of privacy versus accuracy? Is it your suggested privacy loss budget for DCEP? So the 12.2 was arrived at largely as a result of those 600 plus experimental full-scale runs that I mentioned before. We developed a number of accuracy and fitness for use criteria for the redistricting and Voting Rights Act use cases. And those accuracy targets were informed by our interactions with the U.S. Department of Justice's Voting Rights Section, as well as conversations and feedback from experts in the redistricting and Voting Rights Act communities. So we established accuracy targets that we wanted to meet, both for what we call on-spine geographies, like block groups, tracts, and so on, but then also for off-spine geographies that are more challenging to tune to, things like congressional districts, voting districts, precincts, places, incorporated places, and census-designated places, and so on. So we established accuracy targets, and then began examining how varying different parameters, both in terms of allocation of privacy loss budget by geography, allocation across our query sets, et cetera, how those impacted our ability to achieve those targets. And we ultimately landed on the 12.2 level of the privacy loss budget as the point where we were able to consistently meet or exceed those accuracy targets that we had set. So that, again, that was determined for this release of demonstration data. It is our current approximation of where we think DCEP will be considering setting privacy loss budget next month. But before those decisions are made, we want to get data user feedback. Did we get the right level? Do we need to make additional changes? And that's why having our data users evaluate the demonstration data and provide that feedback to us is going to be essential. But yeah, it was our approximation based on those experiments of where we anticipate that final value to be. Okay. Oh, okay, so here's a question. Since differential privacy allows you to precisely control the amount of private information leakage in published statistics, is there a dial or set amount that the Census Bureau has? For example, 0 equals perfect privacy, 10 equals perfect privacy. The Census Bureau's Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee has always had to determine how much privacy protection is sufficient. They've had to do that for traditional disclosure avoidance methods, and they will have to do that in the context of our 2020 Census Disclosure Avoidance System. And that is a complex decision, and it's informed by legal analysis of our obligations under Title 13. It's informed by our own assessments of privacy risk. It's informed by our own mission of producing quality data and ongoing interactions with a broad swath of data users and experts in census data. So there is a trade-off. There's a trade-off between privacy and accuracy. DCEP will have to make difficult decisions about where the appropriate point on that spectrum is. There is no kind of set number that is kind of the standard against which to measure those policy decisions. But ultimately, they're going to have to find the point that the data are sufficiently accurate to meet the statutory and priority uses of census data, while also being sufficiently protected to meet our statutory obligations under Title 15 and our operational and ethical obligations to our respondents. So unfortunately, I can't give you an exact number that is the perfect number. It's a policy decision, and it's going to be a difficult one. Okay. Okay, so question here, does the privacy loss budget stay the same no matter what future privacy risks or privacy attack vectors come out later? Yes, that's actually one of the real advantages of differential privacy as that kind of privacy accounting framework that I mentioned before. Because rather than trying to assess the risk of any particular privacy attack or privacy attack vector, and thus having to make assumptions about how an attacker might attempt to re-identify individuals in our data, which those assumptions may or may not be wrong. Your estimation of risk is only going to be as good as those assumptions you make. Differential privacy, by quantifying the leakage of private information in any statistic, gives you a maximum upper bound on privacy risk, independent of what new types of privacy attacks might arise down the road. And so that privacy loss budget gives you kind of this line in the sand that can't be crossed unless you choose to raise the privacy loss budget. And that's very effective in helping to really precisely control how strong you want your privacy protections to be, or how much privacy loss you're willing to exchange in return for accuracy and fitness for use. Okay, easy question here. Will the PowerPoint be sent to participants? And I actually do not know the answer to that. I don't know if it's going to be posted. Shelley, are you still on the line? Can you answer that one?
Hi, yes, it's actually going to be posted on our website, hopefully this afternoon, but not in a direct email to participants of this call.
Okay. All right, a question here. Can one look at perfect privacy versus perfect accuracy as a seesaw? In a highly simplified view, you could consider it that. A more nuanced interpretation, though, would be lots of individual little seesaws, insofar as your allocation of privacy loss budget and how you implement your noise infusion, all of those parameters and dials I was alluding to before, have an outsized impact on the resulting fitness for use of the data for particular use cases. So choices that you make about how much privacy loss budget to assign to block level statistics versus block group level or tract level, how much privacy loss budget to assign to age by sex pyramids versus total population queries. All of those are going to have significant impacts on the resulting accuracy of particular aspects of the data for particular use cases. If your particular use case relies on tract level data and only tract level data, well, then any privacy loss budget that we would expend at the level below the tract would not benefit you. But if your analysis relies on block group level data, then you'd need to see sufficient privacy loss budget attributed to that in order to yield fit for use data. So there are a lot of decisions that have to be made, a lot of those individual seesaws, if you will, in order to find the optimal setting of all of the parameters of the algorithm's implementation, all of those individual allocations of privacy loss budget in an attempt to maximize fitness for use for the major uses of the resulting data while still sufficiently protecting privacy in the process. I can say, like, one of the biggest challenges with protecting privacy is, for the census, is the sheer quantity of block level data that we publish. And so one of the central kind of design features of our top-down algorithm, which we're going to go into in much more detail in the subsequent webinar on the top-down algorithm. One of the real design features of that is we wanted to find a way that individual block-level census data would be sufficiently noisy to protect privacy, because that's where the greatest privacy risk occurs. But that you could aggregate those individual noisy blocks or noisy pixels into larger geographies of interest and have reliable, accurate statistics for them, so that you could assemble noisy blocks into voting districts or congressional districts or precincts or towns and have highly accurate statistics for those voting districts, for example, made up of the individual noisy pixels. It's like zooming in on your television set. If you zoom in and they're looking at the individual pixels of your TV, you're not going to be able to make out the picture. But if you back away from them, you will still get a highly accurate picture from your television. So the idea is we implemented a noise infusion approach that guarantees that as you aggregate individual noisy blocks together, you're going to get more and more accurate statistics as the underlying population that you're assessing grows. Okay, more questions here. And I apologize, I'm taking these out of order. It's challenging to scroll through the Q&A here and see what's been answered and what hasn't. Does the privacy loss budget take into account differential impact on rural versus urban areas? For example, the balance of privacy versus accuracy would be different depending on population density. No, so the disclosure avoidance system is tuned for counts, and the noise that gets infused is done based on the type of query, not based on the characteristics that are being assessed. So In general, urban areas like urban blocks and rural blocks will get the same relative amount of, the same overall amount of noise to their counts. So in general, you'll see comparable numbers of people being shifted up or down in order to protect privacy. Where you may see a difference in impact is in terms of the relative impact of those changes. So adding one person to a block that has 100 people is going to be a very small relative change. Adding one person to a block that has one person in it is the same overall amount of noise, but if measured as a percentage, may appear to be more substantial. So from the perspective of counts, the difference between rural and urban areas is negligible. From the perspective of percentages, you may notice that if you're looking at very small denominators in your percentage, and so that can be a tricky thing to assess, and it's more advantageous to view those from the perspective of the actual counts. Okay. Okay, so here's a question here about, is differential privacy required to keep information private in group quarters? As you know, some states are required to reallocate certain incarcerated persons. Is it possible to do that reallocation if differential privacy is, applied to the prisons? All of the 2020 census data, with the exception of the apportionment data, will be subject to differentially private noise infusion. And that includes data on group quarters facilities. Now, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of parameters and settings that can be adjusted to ensure fitness for use of the resulting data. And one of the algorithmic changes that we made for the April 2021 demonstration data release was specific changes to the geographic hierarchy that the algorithm uses that were specifically designed to improve accuracy for group quarters data and to prevent the shifting of data about group quarters residents from their surrounding block or block group populations. So we recognize, we've heard from a number of states that they have state laws that require reallocation of individuals in certain types of group homes, whether it's prisons or college dormitories, for example. The new demonstration data reflect those algorithmic improvements that we've made based on some of that feedback. We do encourage you to assess the demonstration data and tell us if those are sufficient to meet your needs. And if they're not, tell us what additional changes you'd like to see. Great question here. Could you discuss the privacy loss budget as it relates to the geographic hierarchy or spine? Will you be releasing how the budget is allocated across the hierarchy in the most recent demonstration data release? Yes, we will. In fact, will be very soon added to the documentation that's on our website for the demonstration data, and I will be specifically walking through the allocation by geographic level and by query in our subsequent webinar on the top-down algorithm, the DP 201 webinar that's coming up. So stay tuned for that. We will be providing that information in substantial detail. Great question here. I'm not sure what you mean by a query. Can you explain? Also a question that we'll be going into in the webinar on the top-down algorithm. But essentially, the way the disclosure avoidance system performs its noise infusion is it does so by essentially taking a massive number of tabulations of the confidential census data and infusing noise into each of those tabulations. So it will ask how many female, American Indian, non-Hispanic, 57-year-olds are there at the county level in this particular county. And it will inject noise into that tabulation. And we ask millions of these tabulations throughout the processing of the algorithm with noise infused into all of those. The set of tabulations that we ask, which variables or which data elements crossed with which other data elements, are known as queries in the algorithm lexicon. And how you ask those, which data elements you query by themselves, which you query crossed with other data elements, which ones you do with the fully saturated contingency table, etc. That set of tabulations that you're performing at any particular geographic level becomes known as your query set or query workload for the algorithm. And that is also what allows you to tune fitness for use for particular statistics in the algorithm. And you can assign privacy loss budget to particular tabulations or cross tabulations for different geographic levels. So that's what I meant by query. And as I said, I'll be going into that more in a subsequent webinar.
Hey, and Michael, we're nearing the top of the hour. I don't know if you have time for one more question, maybe?
Sure. Let me just find a good one to end on. And I apologize that we haven't been able to get to everyone's questions here. But again, we have a whole series of these webinars and look forward to continuing to answer your questions in subsequent sessions. Let's see here. Okay, so here's a good one to end, and it's a good teaser for a subsequent one. Can you tell me what the level of risk of re-identification would be for an epsilon of 10? And my answer would have to be, without knowing how you allocated it, I could not. Now, I could, using the privacy loss budget of 10, tell you the specific amount of like what the maximum upper bound on information loss could be. But how you implement that is going to impact the actual risk of re-identification for any particular attack vector. So without knowing what the attack vector that you have in mind is, what you see as the likely attacker scenario, it would be difficult for me to give you that. But when you make assumptions about what the likely attack scenarios are, what resources an attacker might have, and then you evaluate a particular implementation of that privacy loss budget, then you can absolutely do that, and you can do that through simulation. And that is a great preview of what we're going to go into in our upcoming webinar on the Census Bureau's reconstruction of vetted re-identification simulations, because that's precisely what we've done in that context. So that is how you could quantify. Otherwise, a privacy loss budget by itself quantifies the maximum information leakage that could then inform those attacks. But in order to measure a specific risk given a particular attack vector, you need to make those assumptions first. So with that, we are at the end of the hour. I want to thank all of you for attending today. Please tune in for our subsequent webinars. We've got some great information that's going to be coming your way, and we look forward to continuing to answer your questions through those sessions. Sign up for our newsletters and check out the information we have on our website. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. That does conclude today's conference. Thank you all for participating. You may disconnect at this time.